a wedding dress of imported silk, a room gilded with wealth, and a bride drowning in tears. Eleanora Hayes has just become Mrs. Bartholomew Thorne, shackled to the most powerful and cruelest man in the territory. Her heart is a graveyard, holding the memory of a love stolen from her. She sits alone, a prisoner in white, waiting for the monster who bought her. But the footsteps that echo in the hall, the shadow that falls across her door, do not belong to her husband. It is a man considered a ghost, a savage by the townfolk, an Apache warrior. What he does next will ignite a fire that could either save her or burn them both to ashes. The last ray of the Arizona sun bled across the horizon, painting the dust-choked windows of the bridal suite in hues of blood and rust. From her seat on the edge of the monstrously large mahogany bed, Eleanora Hayes, no Eleanora Thorne, she had to remember the name, now watched the light die. It felt fitting, a death to mirror the one that had taken place inside her own chest hours ago when she'd uttered the words, "I do." The dress was a lie, a confection of ivory silk and French lace that cost more than her family's entire herd of cattle. It felt like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. Her father, his face a mask of grim necessity, had told her it was the price of their survival. Bartholomew Thorne owned the Blackwood Valley, all of it, from the Coyote Creek to the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. He owned the water, and in this parched land, that meant he owned the life and death of every rancher who dared to defy him. Her father, William Hayes, had not dared. He had traded his only daughter for the right to draw water for another season. Tears, hot and silent, tracked clean paths through the fine layer of dust that had settled on her cheeks during the carriage ride from the church. She didn't bother to wipe them away. They were for Leo. Always for Leo. Her mind fled the opulent prison of the room, traveling back 6 months. She saw Leo Vance's smile as wide and honest as the open plains. She felt the calloused warmth of his hand closing over hers as they stood by the creek on her father's land, the only place Thorne's shadow hadn't yet fallen. He was a simple ranch hand, with eyes the color of a summer sky, and a heart devoted to 2 things: raising horses. And her. "We'll go to California. Ellie," he'd whispered, his breath warm against her ear, the scent of leather and sunshine clinging to him. "We'll find a place by the ocean, a place where no man can own the water." The dream had been their secret comfort, a promise whispered in stolen moments in the hayloft and by moonlight rides. It was a fragile thing, and Bartholomew Thorne had crushed it with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. Thorne had seen her in the town of Harmony Creek during the Founders' Day celebration. His eyes, small and dark like a boar's, had latched onto her with a chilling possessiveness. He was a man of acquisitions, and he had decided he wanted to acquire her. The courtship was a siege. He didn't bring flowers, he brought threats veiled in polite conversation. He spoke to her father of diverted streams and foreclosure notices. He admired the Hayes Ranch, noting aloud how flammable a dry barn could be in the summer heat. Leo brave and foolish, Leo had confronted him. Eleanora wasn't there, but she heard the story from a trembling stable boy. Leo had stood up to Thorne in the middle of the saloon, calling him a land thief and a coward. Thorne hadn't even raised his voice. He'd simply smiled a tight, predatory curl of his lips and gestured to his 2 hired guns, the brutish Flannery brothers. They'd beaten Leo senseless and dragged him out of town. The official story delivered by Sheriff Collier, a man whose pockets were lined with Thorne's gold, was that Leo Vance had been run off for being a drunken troublemaker. But Eleanora knew better. She'd felt it in her soul the moment she'd heard. Leo was gone. Not run off, gone forever. Thorne had made a space for himself in her life by carving Leo out of it. 2 weeks later, the wedding was announced. A sharp rap on the door jolted her back to the present. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Mrs. Thorne, a woman's voice called timid. It was Martha, the housekeeper, a woman with eyes that held a permanent look of fear. "Mr. Thorne says he'll be up in an hour. He's concluding some business with his men. He wishes for you to be ready." Ready. The word was a violation. Ready for what? To be another one of his possessions, a beautiful doll to be displayed and used. The bile rose in her throat. She managed a choked, "Thank you, Martha." The footsteps receded. An hour! She had 1 hour of her own life left before it truly belonged to him. She stood the silk dress, whispering around her ankles. The room was a monument to Thorne's wealth. A thick Persian rug covered the floor. A vanity of polished cherry wood held crystal bottles of perfume she would never wear. On the wall hung a painting of a storm-tossed sea, a scene of such violent chaos it seemed a window into her own soul. She walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtain. The main ranch house was ablaze with light. Laughter, coarse and drunken, drifted up from the courtyard below. Thorne's wedding celebration. A gathering of vultures, men who fed off his power and cruelty. She could see them, their faces flushed with whiskey, their loyalty bought and paid for. Her eyes scanned the darkness beyond the ring of light. The vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert stretched out a sea of shadows under a blanket of cold, distant stars. Freedom was out there somewhere, but it was 1,000 miles away, across a land that would kill a lone woman in a day. Escape was a fantasy. She let the curtain fall. The reflection in the dark glass showed a stranger, a pale, hollow-eyed woman in a ridiculously expensive dress. The fight had gone out of her. Thorne had won. He'd taken her love, her future, and her family's dignity. Now he would take the rest. With a sob that tore from the very depths of her being, Eleonora stumbled back to the bed. She didn't sit on the edge this time. She collapsed into the center of the goose-down mattress, curling into a ball, heedless of the perfect silk and lace. She was a child again, lost and terrified, wishing for a father who could protect her, not sell her. She wept for Leo, for the life they would never have, for the fresh grave in her heart that no one else could see. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned alone in the gilded cage her husband had built for her. The sounds of the party below began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic creak of the house, settling, and the mournful cry of a distant coyote. The hour was nearly up. Her tears subsided into shuddering breaths. She lay there listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow sealing her fate. Then she heard a sound that didn't belong. Not the drunken stomp of her husband's boots, not the timid shuffle of a servant. It was a soft, almost imperceptible scrape, like a leather moccasin on a wooden floorboard. It came from the balcony. Her breath hitched. She went utterly still, every nerve ending screaming. The balcony door was ajar, left open earlier to catch the faint evening breeze. A sliver of moonlight cut across the floor, and in that sliver a shadow moved. It was tall and lean, and it detached itself from the deeper shadows of the doorway, stepping silently, fluidly into her room. The man who called himself Chaitan moved with the practiced silence of a predator. To the white men, the Pindalikoyi, he was a ghost, a whisper of a threat on the edges of their loud, clumsy world. To his own people, the Chiricahua Apache, he was a falcon, the one who sees from a distance, who marks every detail, who understands the currents of the world below. For 3 days he had been watching from the Thorne Ranch. He laid belly down on a sun-scorched ridge a mile away, the coarse granite pressing into him, his body one with the land. He needed no spyglass. His eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. He watched the constant movement of Thorne's hired gunsmen, who wore their cruelty like a badge. He watched the cattle, their ribs showing, being driven too hard toward the overgrazed pastures, near the only reliable spring, a spring that had once belonged to his people. Bartholomew Thorne was more than just a greedy rancher. He was a poison in the land. He had broken the treaty signed by his own government, diverting the water from the creek that fed the reservation lands, downstream, leaving Chayton's people with dust and dying crops. He paid the Indian agent, a corpulent sweating man named Peterson, to look the other way. He was a liar and a thief, but a thief who cloaked his crimes in signed papers and legal jargon the elders didn't understand. Chayton understood. He had learned the white man's tongue, not from a school, but from listening, from observing, from captivity, in a fort as a boy. He had learned their words, and more importantly, he had learned the hollowness behind them. His purpose here was not war. Not yet. It was to find a weakness, a crack in Thorne's armor, a piece of leverage that could force the water back to its rightful course before his people starved or were forced to fight a battle they could not win. Today the ranch had been a hive of frantic activity. Carriages had arrived, kicking up plumes of dust. Men in stiff suits and women in bright, ridiculous dresses had flooded the courtyard. A wedding. The falcon had watched the ceremony from afar, a strange and ugly ritual where a man publicly declared ownership of a woman. He had seen the bride a flash of white, her face veiled and unreadable from his perch. He had seen Thorne thick and powerful, his posture radiating an arrogance that set Chayton's teeth on edge. As night fell, the celebration devolved into a drunken roar that echoed across the valley, an insult to the sacred silence of the desert. This was his chance. With the guards distracted by whiskey and boasting the ranch's defenses would be at their weakest. He moved from the ridge as the moon climbed a phantom, gliding through mesquite and scrub brush. He knew the layout of the ranch intimately. He had studied it, memorized every path, every shadow. He avoided the main gate instead, approaching from the sheer cliffs at the back of the property, a route the white men considered impassable. For him it was a familiar ladder of handholds and footholds. He scaled the rock face with the ease of a mountain goat, his moccasined feet finding purchase, where a booted man would find none. He dropped silently into the shadows of the stables, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. The horses, sensing a presence that was not a threat, remained quiet. He navigated the maze of outbuildings, his knife in his hand, his senses alive to every sound. The loud music and laughter from the main house were a perfect cover. His target was Thorne's office. He had seen the light burning there late at night on previous vigils. It was where the man kept his papers, his maps, his ledgers. The proof of his crimes, Chayton believed, would be in that room, written in the white man's spidery script. The office was on the ground floor, its window barred, but a large trellis, thick with climbing roses, ran up the stone wall of the house, reaching the second-story balcony of the master suite. It was a risky path, but the most direct. He tested the trellis. It was old wood, but strong. He began to climb, moving with a slow, deliberate grace, his body a dark shape against the darker stone. He reached the balcony and pulled himself over the railing, his feet making no sound on the wooden planks. The laughter from below was louder here. He pressed himself against the wall, a shadow among shadows, and peered through the open doors. And that is when he saw her, the bride. She was not the triumphant queen of the celebration he had imagined. She was a small, broken figure, curled on a bed so large it seemed to be swallowing her. The opulent white dress was crumpled around her. Her shoulders shook with silent, gut-wrenching sobs. The sound was inaudible over the party below, but he could see it feel the waves of despair that radiated from her. He had seen grief before. He had seen it in his own mother's eyes when his brother had not returned from a raid. He had felt it himself when the sickness took his young wife years ago. But this was different. This was the grief of a caged thing, a wild bird with its wings broken, trapped in a golden cage. It was a despair so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. He forgot about the office. He forgot about the ledgers and the maps. The Falcon the Observer was transfixed by this display of raw, private agony. He saw not the wife of his enemy, but a fellow creature in pain. This woman was no conqueror. She was a captive, another victim of Bartholomew Thorne. He watched as her sobs subsided into exhausted shudders. He saw her walk to the window and look out into the same night he inhabited her face, a mask of utter hopelessness. His people had a word for it, tando bega. The feeling of being utterly without a path, lost in a sunless canyon. He did not know why he did it. It was an impulse, a violation of all his training, a risk that could get him killed. But he could not simply turn away. The sight of her profound sorrow resonated with a deep ancestral instinct within him, an imperative to offer comfort to the helpless, even the helpless of your enemy. He waited until she had collapsed back onto the bed, her weeping spent. The house had grown quieter. The ticking of a clock was now audible. He knew Thorne would be coming soon. It was now or never. Taking a steadying breath, he pushed away from the wall. He was a ghost, a whisper. He stepped over the threshold from the cool night air into the suffocating stillness of the room. He let the moonlight touch him first, so he would not be a figure leaping from complete darkness. He moved slowly, deliberately, making a single soft sound with his foot on the floorboards to announce his presence, to give her a moment's warning before she saw him. He was not a monster come to harm her. He was a witness. Eleonora's blood ran cold. The sound, so faint but so deliberate, had come from the balcony. Her grief-stricken paralysis shattered, replaced by a primal, heart-pounding terror. It was him. Thorne. He had come early, creeping into the room like a predator to toy with his prey. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the feel of his heavy hand on her shoulder, the reek of whiskey on his breath. But the footfalls that followed were wrong. They were too light, too quiet. They were almost soundless, more a whisper of movement than a step. She forced her eyes open, her gaze darting towards the balcony doors. The man standing there was not her husband. He was tall and lean-built of whipcord muscle, not the brutish bulk she associated with Thorne and his men. He stood just inside the sliver of moonlight streaming into the room, his form a stark silhouette. His hair was long black and unbound, falling past his shoulders. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple collarless shirt. A knife was sheathed at his belt, and the moonlight glinted off the honed edge. But it was his face that held her frozen. It was a face carved from the very rock of the mountains that loomed over the valley, all sharp angles and stark plains with high cheekbones and a strong, unyielding jaw. His skin was the color of rich, sun-baked earth. He was an Apache. Every horror story she had ever heard, every whispered tale of raids and massacres, coalesced into a single paralyzing wave of fear. She was alone, trapped on the second floor with a savage who had somehow breached the fortress of the Thorne Ranch. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a dry, rasping gasp escaped. Her throat had closed with terror. The warrior didn't move. He simply stood there, his dark eyes fixed on her. They were not filled with the malice or lust she would have expected. They were calm, steady, and unnervingly perceptive. It felt as if he were not just looking at her, but seeing her, seeing the torn silk, the tear-stained face, the utter despair coiling in her gut. He seemed to be waiting, giving her a moment to absorb his presence, to see that he was not charging, not attacking. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand, palm open in a gesture that was universally understood. Peace. It was a small movement, but it broke the spell of her terror. The scream died in her throat, replaced by a trembling confusion. Why wasn't he killing her? Why wasn't he grabbing the silver candlesticks or the jewelry on the vanity? He took a step forward out of the moonlight and into the room's gloom. She flinched, scrambling backward on the bed until her back hit the ornate headboard. He stopped immediately, holding his position, respecting the boundary of her fear. They remained that way for a long moment, a silent tableau of captive and intruder, the only sound the frantic hammering of her own heart. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the opulent furniture, the silk curtains, the crystal perfume bottles. His expression was unreadable, but Eleonora sensed a deep and profound contempt in his stillness. His eyes finally returned to her, and then they drifted down to her feet. She followed his gaze. Her shoes, delicate slippers of white satin, were caked in dust from the walk from the church to the carriage, and from the carriage to the house. The fine red dirt of Arizona was ground into the pristine fabric, a stain of the real harsh world on the fantasy of the wedding. They felt heavy like shackles. The warrior took another slow step, and then another. He did not approach the bed directly, but moved in a soft arc towards the foot of it. He was a dozen feet away when he did something that defied all logic, all expectation. He knelt, not in supplication, but with a simple fluid grace. He lowered himself to one knee on the thick Persian rug. His eyes never left hers, holding her gaze, asking for permission, for trust. Eleonora's mind reeled. An Apache warrior was kneeling in her bedroom. He was not threatening her. He was not robbing her. He was waiting. Her fear, while still present, was being crowded out by a disorienting wave of utter bewilderment. He gestured with his chin towards her feet, a minute questioning movement. She didn't understand. He gestured again, and this time he pointed a single finger towards her dusty shoes. Her breath caught. It was impossible. It was insane. But there was no other explanation for his focus, for the way he knelt before her. He wanted to untie her shoes. Hesitantly, almost involuntarily, she shifted, extending one leg slightly. It was a gesture of acquiescence, a tiny flicker of trust in a situation that made no sense. It was enough for him. He moved forward on his knees, his approach silent and deferential. He stopped just before her, the scent of sage and clean desert air reaching her, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the room. He reached out his hands, long-fingered and strong. For a terrifying second, she thought she had misjudged that he would grab her ankle and pull her from the bed. But his touch was unbelievably gentle. His fingers brushed against the silk of her stocking as he located the satin ribbons of her slipper. He worked with a focused, unhurried precision, his movements economical and deft. He loosened the knot, his knuckles brushing against her skin, a touch that held no threat, only a strange, impersonal tenderness. He slid the shoe from her foot, the grit of the dust scraping softly against the silk. He placed the slipper carefully on the floor beside him. Then he looked at her, his dark eyes asking permission to continue. She nodded, a barely perceptible movement of her head, her throat too tight to speak. He repeated the action with her other shoe, his movements just as deliberate, just as respectful. When both shoes were off, he placed the second one neatly beside the first. He remained kneeling for a moment, his task complete. He had removed the dusty binding things that tied her to the miserable journey of the day. It was a small act, a simple service, but in the context of her utter powerlessness, it felt monumental. It was the first act of kindness she had been shown all day. A kindness from the most unlikely source imaginable. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion. He looked at her one last time, a long, searching look. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but something that looked like understanding. A shared recognition of a common enemy. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. And then, as silently as he had arrived, he turned and walked back to the balcony. He slipped through the open doors and was gone, vanishing into the night. It was as if he had been a dream, a hallucination born of grief and fear. But he was not. On the floor beside the bed sat her 2 dusty satin slippers, placed side by side, a tangible testament to the impossible event that had just occurred. Eleonora stared at them, her mind struggling to process it. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a tiny ember in the cold ashes of her despair. She was still a prisoner. She was still married to a monster. But for the first time that day, she was not entirely alone. The first weeks of Eleonora's marriage were a lesson in quiet horror. Bartholomew Thorne was a man of meticulous habits and chilling moods. He treated her not as a wife, but as his most prized possession, a porcelain figurine to be kept on a high shelf, admired for its beauty, and handled only when he saw fit. He paraded her before his business associates' men with equally hard eyes and greedy smiles, his hand always possessively on her waist or the small of her back, a constant branding touch. He never raised his voice to her. His cruelty was more insidious. It was in the coldness of his eyes when she failed to smile brightly enough, the dismissive wave of his hand when she offered an opinion, the way he would praise her beauty in front of others, as if she were a horse whose teeth and fetlocks he was appraising. Their conversations were sterile, one-sided affairs where he spoke of his land, his cattle, his power. He demanded nothing of her but her silent, decorative presence. In a way, his indifference was more terrifying than outright abuse. It rendered her invisible, an object without a soul. The nights were the worst. He would come to her bed, not with passion, but with a clinical detached sense of ownership, a duty he performed with grim efficiency. Eleonora learned to retreat deep inside herself, to a place in her mind where she could still smell the sunshine on Leo's skin, where she could hear his laughter. It was a desperate spiritual self-preservation, but each night a piece of that sanctuary crumbled. Her days were spent in suffocating idleness within the sprawling ranch house. Martha, the timid housekeeper, and the other servants treated her with a fearful deference, their eyes always skittering away from hers. They knew as she did that she was just another captive in Thorne's kingdom. But Eleonora was not porcelain. She was forged from the same stubborn stock as the pioneers who had settled this land. The initial shock and despair began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning, deeply rooted anger. The memory of the Apache warrior's visit served as a constant secret reminder that the world was not entirely as it seemed. His silent act of kindness was a seed of defiance planted in the barren soil of her existence. She began to watch, to listen. She feigned meekness and compliance, but her mind was sharp, cataloguing every detail. She noticed the nervous glances between the ranch hands when Thorne rode past, the way they flinched from his shadow. She overheard snippets of conversation about a neighboring rancher, a man named Patterson, whose well had mysteriously gone dry just before Thorne conveniently offered to buy his land for pennies on the dollar. She saw the Flannery brothers Thorne's hired guns ride out late at night and return before dawn. Their horses lathered their faces, grimly satisfied. She started to believe the warrior had not come to her by accident. He was watching Thorne too, The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had a silent, unseen ally in the vast wilderness. A month into her marriage, she devised a reason to ride out alone. She told Thorn she wished to paint the desert wildflowers an acceptably feminine and harmless pastime. He grunted his approval, sending one of his men, a cowboy named Hank, with vacant eyes to follow her at a discreet distance. She rode towards the low-lying mesas to the south, a place of stark and lonely beauty. She dismounted, setting up her small easel, as a pretext, her heart thumping with a mixture of hope and fear. She dabbed paint onto the canvas, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, searching for a sign. For 2 hours there was nothing but the wind and the sun. Hank sat his horse a quarter-mile off a bored sentinel. Disappointment began to set in. Had she imagined it all? Was she truly alone? She was packing her paints when a shadow fell over her. Not from a cloud, but from a hawk circling high overhead. It soared in a lazy, deliberate circle, then another. It was a sign. She felt it, a certainty that settled deep in her bones. Her gaze followed the hawk's flight path, tracing it down to a jumble of red rocks 100 yards away. And there he was. Chayton. He was standing between two boulders, almost invisible, his form blending perfectly with the rock and shadow. He had been there the whole time, watching her. Their eyes met across the distance. He gave a single, slow nod. She felt a jolt, a current of recognition and shared purpose. She had to speak to him, but how Hank was watching. Thinking quickly, she pretended to stumble, sending her canvas tumbling down a short, steep embankment into a thicket of mesquite. "Oh, confound it all!" she cried with enough theatrical frustration to sound convincing. She waved a dismissive hand at Hank, who had started to move his horse forward. "I can get it. Don't trouble yourself." She scrambled down the embankment, disappearing from Hank's line of sight for a precious few moments. The warrior was already moving, meeting her in the dense scrub. He moved so silently she didn't hear him until he was just feet away. "Why do you watch him?" she whispered, her voice urgent. Chayton's English was heavily accented, but clear, his words chosen with care. "He steals water. From my people, from your people. He is a snake who poisons the earth. The Pattersons," she asked. "Did he poison their well? He damned the stream that fed it. Miles upstream, in the canyons, where no one looks, the casual evil of it took her breath away. Can you prove it?" He shook his head. "The sheriff is his dog. The judge is his friend. A red man's word is wind." He paused, his dark eyes intense. "But his lies are written on paper, in his house, in a room with a barred window, Thorn's office, the place her husband sometimes locked himself in for hours. There is more," Chayton said, his voice dropping lower. "The man you knew, the one with the sun in his hair. Leo Vance." Eleonora's heart stopped. What about him? She breathed, her blood turning to ice. Thorn's men didn't run him from town. Chayton said his words, flat and brutal. "They took him north to the canyons. I found where they camped. I found his trail. And then I found where it ended." He didn't need to say more. The finality in his tone was absolute. He hadn't just been driven off. He had been executed. A wave of blackness washed over Eleonora. The world tilted, the buzz of insects in the scrub growing to a roar in her ears. She leaned a hand against a rock to steady herself. The grief was a physical blow so savage and fresh, it felt like she was learning of his death for the very first time. Thorn hadn't just taken her future. He was a murderer. "Mrs. Thorn." "You all right down there?" Hank's voice called from the ridge. "I'm fine," she called back, her voice shaking. She turned back to Chayton, her tears now tears of pure, unadulterated rage. The meek, grieving girl was gone, burned away by this new horrific truth. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose. "Help me," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "Help me destroy him." Chaitan looked at her truly, looked at her, and for the first time he saw not a victim, but a warrior. He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine. He gave another slow nod. The falcon sees everything. The snake will not know the hunter is there until it feels the strike. He melted back into the rocks, disappearing as if he were never there. Eleonora retrieved her canvas, her hands steady now. As she rode back to the ranch, she did not look back. She looked forward towards the house that had been her prison. Now it was a hunting ground, and she was no longer the prey. The Thorn Ranch house, once a symbol of Eleonora's imprisonment, transformed into a chessboard. Every hallway was a potential avenue of attack, every closed door a hidden move. Her grief for Leo was a cold, hard stone in her chest, but her rage was a fire that fueled a cunning she never knew she possessed. She began to play the part of the docile, devoted wife with a chilling perfection. She smiled at Thorn, tended to his needs, and organized his social affairs all the while, watching his every move like a hawk. Her alliance with Chaitan was one of whispers and signs. A red ribbon tied to a specific fence post meant she needed to speak with him. A single clear bird call at dusk from the cottonwoods by the creek was his reply. A displaced stone near the back porch signaled a package left in a hollow log. They were two spies operating in enemy territory, bound by a common goal. Chaitan became her eyes and ears beyond the ranch. He would leave her notes written in charcoal on scraps of bark, detailing Thorn's secret meetings, the names of men who rode with the Flannery brothers, the locations of newly dug ditches that diverted water under the cover of darkness. He drew her maps of the canyons, marking the hidden dam that had ruined the Patterson family and the approximate location where Leo had met his end. Eleonora's mission was inside the house to get into Thorn's office and find the documents that would corroborate Chaitan's intelligence. The office was Thorn's sanctuary, the one room she was explicitly forbidden from entering. He kept it locked at all times, the key, a heavy, ornate piece of brass that never left his person. For weeks, she observed his routine. He worked in the office every morning after breakfast, and for 2 hours every night after dinner. He always locked the door, even if he was just stepping out to speak to his foreman. Her first task was to get a copy of the key. The opportunity came during a dinner party Thorn was hosting for a cattle baron from Tucson. Eleonora, playing the perfect hostess, ensured the wine flowed freely. She watched Thorn waiting for the moment his guard was down. Late in the evening, flush with arrogance and too much brandy, he leaned back in his chair, boasting about a recent land acquisition. The key ring was on his belt, just visible. Eleonora had prepared for this. In her apron pocket, she had a small, soft block of wax warmed by her body heat. She accidentally stumbled near her husband, dropping her napkin. As she bent to retrieve it, apologizing profusely, her hands worked quickly under the cover of the tablecloth. She pressed the wax block firmly against the office key, capturing its intricate shape. It took less than 3 seconds. No one noticed. The next day she feigned a headache and sent Martha into Harmony Creek for medicine. While the house was quiet, she used the wax impression and a small file taken from the tool shed to painstakingly shape a spare skeleton key she had found in a dusty box of forgotten hardware. It was a crude copy, but she hoped it would be enough. That night, she waited until the house was silent, until Thorn's snores rumbled from his separate bedroom down the hall, a small mercy she was grateful for. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. As she slipped out of her room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows, the moonlight through the windows, casting long, ghostly fingers on the walls. She reached the office door, her hand trembling, as she inserted her makeshift key into the lock. It resisted. She held her breath, jiggling it gently, applying careful pressure. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it wouldn't work. Then, with a soft metallic click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent house, the lock turned. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her without locking it, and was enveloped in the scent of old paper leather and Thorne's bay rum cologne. The room was dark, but she had memorized the layout. She moved swiftly to the massive oak desk, not daring to light a lamp. She had to work by moonlight alone. Her fingers flew across the desk, searching. The top was neat, organized. Ledgers, contracts, correspondence. It was a mountain of paper. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. A deed. A signed confession. She started with the main ledger. Column after column of numbers, cattle sales, supply, costs. It was meaningless to her. She moved to the drawers. The first two were unlocked, filled with more mundane business papers. The third, a deep drawer on the bottom right, was locked. She used her key again. This lock was stiffer, but it too finally gave way. Inside it was different. This was not for public display. Here were the real records of Thorne's empire. She found a leather-bound journal. Her hand shaking, she carried it to the window, angling the pages to catch the faint moonlight. It was his private ledger. And it was all there. Undated entries detailed payments to Sheriff Collier and the Indian agent Peterson. There were notes about resolving the Patterson water issue, followed by an expense entry for shovels and black powder. And then she found it. An entry from 6 months ago. It didn't mention Leo by name. It was colder, more chilling than that. Expense Flannery Brothers bonus for silencing the Hayes stable boy. Permanent solution. Problem resolved. A gasp escaped her lips, and she clamped a hand over her mouth. Permanent solution. The words were a death sentence, written in her husband's neat, arrogant script. This was it. This was the proof. This ledger was the key to his undoing. She couldn't take the whole book. He would notice its absence immediately. She needed a copy of that one page, but how she had no time. Then her eyes fell on a small box on the desk. It contained tracing paper which Thorne used for copying maps. Working with frantic speed, she placed a sheet over the damning page. Using a piece of charcoal from the fireplace, she carefully, meticulously rubbed over the paper, creating a perfect ghostly image of Thorne's handwriting. The words appeared dark and undeniable. Permanent solution. She had just finished when she heard it. A floorboard creaked in the hall upstairs. Thorne was stirring. Panic seized her. She shoved the tracing paper into the bodice of her nightgown, slammed the ledger shut, and threw it back in the drawer. She locked it, then stood and nearly stumbled over the wastebasket. Her eyes darted down. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper, a telegram. Smoothing it out in the moonlight, she read the few short lines. To B. Thorne, Blackwood Valley. Peterson reports. Apache scout named Chayton asking questions on res consider him hostile. Authorize any means necessary. End. They knew about Chayton. Thorne knew. Footsteps sounded on the main staircase. He was coming down. She didn't have time to get back to her room. She flew across the office, unlocked the door, and slipped out, leaving her crude key still in the lock in her haste. She didn't run down the hall. She darted into the parlor across from the office, hiding behind a thick velvet curtain, just as Thorne's heavy figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs holding a lamp. He was frowning, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He walked directly to his office door. He saw the key. His face darkened with fury. He ripped the key from the lock, recognized it as a forgery, and threw it to the floor. He unlocked the door with his own key and stormed inside. From her hiding place, Eleonora could hear him ransacking the room drawers being pulled open, papers shuffling. He was checking to see what had been disturbed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The tracing paper felt like a sheet of fire against her skin. She had the proof, but she was trapped. Her gambit had succeeded, but it had also sprung the trap. The hunter was now the hunted. The sound of Thorn's rage was a low, guttural rumble like a cornered bear. Eleonora pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the parlor, her breath held so tight her lungs ached. She heard him check the ledger, his profane curse echoing softly in the silent house, when he apparently found nothing amiss. He hadn't thought to check for a tracing. He was looking for something stolen, not something copied. It was a small, crucial oversight. But he knew someone had been in his sanctuary. His heavy boots stomped out of the office. The beam from his lamp cut across the parlor doorway, sweeping inches from her hiding place. He was hunting. He bellowed for his foreman, then for the Flannery brothers. The house erupted into a chaos of shouted orders and running feet. Eleonora knew she had only moments. She couldn't get back to her room. Her only escape was the front door, out into the hostile open courtyard. It was suicide, but staying was a death sentence. With the tracing of the ledger tucked securely in her nightgown, she took the ultimate risk. While Thorn was shouting at his men in the back of the house, she slipped from the parlor. She didn't run. She glided a ghost in white across the grand foyer. The massive oak door was her only barrier. Its hinges were old and loud. She turned the handle with infinite slowness, pulling the door inward, just enough to slip through. The groan of the wood seemed to scream in the night. She was outside. The cool night air was a shock to her skin. The courtyard was lit by a few stray lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. The bunkhouse was now a hive of activity men, spilling out, grabbing rifles. She ran. Kicking off her slippers, she fled across the hard-packed dirt, her bare feet protesting against the sharp gravel. She wasn't running aimlessly. She was running towards the cottonwoods by the creek, the place Chayton had designated as their final emergency rendezvous. "There she is," a voice roared from the porch. It was Thorn. A gunshot cracked the night the bullet whining past her ear with a vicious hiss. The hunt was on. More shouts erupted behind her. The thunder of running boots grew closer. She didn't dare look back. She poured every ounce of her strength, her fear, her rage into her flight. The trees were 100 yards away, a wall of impenetrable darkness that promised safety. She plunged into the thicket branches, whipping at her face, and arms tearing at her thin nightgown. She could hear them crashing through the brush behind her, their lanterns swinging wildly, their curses fouling the air. She was faster here, more nimble, but they were closing in. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind the massive trunk of an ancient cottonwood. She let out a yelp before the hand clamped gently over her mouth. "Be still," Chayton's voice whispered in her ear. He was there. He had heard the shot. He was not alone. 3 other Apache warriors, their faces grim and determined, materialized from the shadows around them. They were armed with bows and rifles, their movements utterly silent. "He knows about you." Eleonora gasped, pulling the tracing from her bodice. A telegram. "They're hunting you, too." Chayton took the paper, his eyes scanning it in the dim light. His expression did not change, but a new hardness settled in his jaw. "His cage is broken. Now the snake will strike at everything that moves." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "We must go. Now." To the horses. The Flannery brothers and 3 other ranch hands burst into the clearing, their lanterns cutting through the gloom. They saw Eleonora and Chayton instantly. "Well, look what we have here," the older Flannery sneered, raising his rifle. The little missus found herself a red-skinned pet. Before he could finish the sentence, an arrow hissed out of the darkness, striking the lantern he was holding. It shattered, plunging their side of the clearing into shadow. In the same instant, Chaitin shoved Eleonora behind him, drawing his knife. The other Apaches let out a sharp, piercing cry that was designed to terrify, and it worked. The ranch hands, expecting a lone woman, hesitated, their confidence shaken. That hesitation was all Chaitin needed. He lunged forward, not at the men but at the ground, scooping up a handful of dirt and flinging it into the face of the nearest cowboy. As the man recoiled, sputtering, Chaitin's other warriors opened fire. It was not a wild volley, but a coordinated, disciplined attack. One ranch hand went down with a rifle ball to the shoulder. Another cried out as an arrow embedded itself in his thigh. Eleonora didn't cower. Fueled by adrenaline, she saw a pistol tucked into the belt of the man Chaitin had blinded. As he staggered, she lunged forward, snatched the weapon, and turned her hand surprisingly steady as she aimed it at the remaining Flannery brother. Thorne himself came crashing through the trees. "Don't kill her, I want her alive!" He roared, his face purple with rage. Flannery ignored him, leveling his rifle at Chaitin. Eleonora didn't think. She fired. The Colt bucked in her hand, the sound deafening. Her shot went wide, but it served its purpose. Flannery flinched his own shot, going wild, splintering the tree above Chaitin's head. "This way," Chaitin yelled, grabbing her hand. They plunged deeper into the woods, his warriors providing covering fire. Bullets tore through the leaves around them. They ran hand in hand, Chaitin guiding her through the darkness with an unerring sense of direction. They reached the creek and splashed through the shallow water, the cold shock a welcome relief. On the far side, tethered in a hidden grove, were 5 tough-looking Apache ponies. Chaitin lifted Eleonora onto the back of one, as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. His warriors mounted their own horses in a single, fluid motion. They burst from the cover of the trees and onto the open plain, urging the ponies into a dead run. Behind them, they could hear Thorne and his men getting to their own horses, their enraged shouts carrying on the night air. The chase was a desperate, thundering flight across the moonlit desert. The Apache ponies were swift and sure-footed, but Thorne's ranch horses had longer legs. The pursuit was relentless. Gunshots echoed behind them, flashes of orange in the darkness. Chaitin guided them not across the flatlands, but toward the jagged, treacherous terrain of the canyons his world. He led them on a dizzying path through narrow gorges and over rocky passes where Thorne's larger horses struggled. The sounds of pursuit began to fade, swallowed by the labyrinth of rock. Hours later, as the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, Chaitin finally brought them to a halt in a hidden box canyon, its entrance shielded by a thick growth of mesquite. They were safe for now. Eleonora slid from the horse, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. Her nightgown was in tatters, her feet and arms were cut and bruised, but she was alive. And she was free. She looked at Chaitin, his face illuminated by the soft morning light. In his hand, he still held the fragile piece of tracing paper, the proof of Thorne's evil, the key to his destruction, and the reason for their furious, desperate flight. The reckoning had begun, but the war was far from over. The box canyon offered a brief sanctuary. As the first light touched the canyon walls, Chaitin tended to Eleonora's cuts with a quiet, dispassionate gentleness. He tore a strip from his own shirt, dipped it in a hidden spring, and cleaned the grime from her wounds. The tracing paper, their only weapon, was tucked safely in his medicine pouch. "He will send trackers," Chaitin said, his voice low. "We cannot stay." "Where do we go?" Eleonora asked, her body aching with exhaustion. "He owns the law here. His power has borders." Chaitin replied, his eyes on the horizon. "We ride for the U.S. Marshals in Tucson. His gold does not reach that far." Their respite was cut short, by a warning from one of his warriors' riders were approaching, and fast. The desperate flight resumed. They pushed their horses across the sun-blasted plains, the pursuit relentless. Thorn and his men appeared behind them, dark specks growing larger, their victory shouts carried on the wind. Ahead, the crumbling adobe walls of an abandoned Spanish mission offered the only hope of survival. They galloped through the collapsed archway, just moments ahead of their pursuers, taking cover behind the thick, ruined walls. "There's no escape." Eleanora Thorne roared from outside his voice, venomous. "Give me my wife and the Apache, and I'll let the rest of you live." The fight was a blur of dust and gunfire. Thorne's men charged only to be met by the disciplined fire of Chaitan's warriors. In the chaos, Thorne himself, blinded by rage, stormed the courtyard alone, his pistol blazing. He saw Eleanora and raised his weapon. "You are mine," he bellowed. Before he could fire, Chaitan was on him. The fight was short and brutal ending, not with a gunshot, but with Chaitan's knife at the throat of the defeated land baron. Seeing their leader captured, Thorne's remaining men scattered into the desert. 2 days later, Eleanora stood on the porch of the marshal's office in Tucson, watching a new sunrise. Thorne was in a federal cell. The tracing paper, along with a full confession, coerced from the terrified rancher, was enough. His empire of fear would be dismantled. Chaitan stood beside her. His warriors had already departed, carrying the news of their victory home. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I will go home," she said, her voice steady. "I will run my father's ranch and make it my own." "And you, I will go home," he echoed. The falcon must watch over his own nest. Their paths were diverging. He belonged to the mountains, and she to the world of fences and deeds. He reached out and took her hand, a gesture not of a lover, but of a comrade. "May your sun always rise bright, Eleanora Hayes, and may your falcons always fly free, Chaitan," she replied. He gave a final deep nod of respect, turned and rode out of town. Eleanora watched him go, a solitary figure, heading back to the wilderness that had forged him, leaving her to face the dawn finally, and truly free. Eleanora's journey from a weeping bride to a woman of unshakable courage is a testament to the fire that can be found in the deepest despair. Her alliance with Chaitan, a man from a world she was taught to fear, proves that true justice and honor are not defined by race or creed, but by action. They were two people from different worlds who found a common cause, and in doing so, rewrote their own destinies. Their story reminds us that even in the most lawless of times, the bravest acts come from the heart, and the most powerful alliances are forged not in strength, but in shared humanity. If this story of survival courage and an unlikely bond resonated with you, please hit the like button, share it with fellow fans of the Old West, and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales that bring history to life. Your support helps us keep telling these timeless stories.